So I'm going to go ahead and just go over the very basics of what you need to brew. When it comes to wines and meads, they are the easiest thing in the world to get into. Very, very low barrier of entry. All you need is honey or some other source of sugar, some water, and any kind of yeast will work. There's bread yeast. It works. It's not very consistent, but it will do the trick and will come out tasting all right. Or you can get actual brewing yeast. This here is Lalvin D47. This is probably my favorite yeast that I've used. It will generally go up to about 15% or so. However, I have had one bottle of this, which was in a sizer, which was an apple juice instead of water mead. Actually went up to about 19.5%. So if you treat it right, it'll come out pretty strong. So yeah, honey, water, yeast, and a jug to put it in. That's really all you need to get something going. Now, as far as sugars go, this is something for the yeast to ferment. The yeast will eat the sugars along with any oxygens in there to get the colony going, and then they'll start converting the sugars into alcohol and CO2 gas, which is why you don't want to have it in a enclosed, completely tightened up container, because they will bubble up, and if you're using a glass container or a bottle, they can explode, which is not fun. But as long as you have either a loose fitting lid or an actual airlock of some type, that will keep that from happening and keep anything you don't want from getting into it. Now when it comes to the sugars, like I mentioned, any sugars will work. You can use fruit juice, you can use honey, you can use regular table sugar. I don't recommend using regular table sugar because while yes, it will produce alcohol, it'll kind of taste like diluted vodka if you just let it get real. If you let it go all the way and come out dry, as in no sugar left. So I don't recommend it. Juices, you can use any juice, really. You can use apple juice, you can use grape juice, you can use cranberry cocktail, whatever. It doesn't really matter. I would recommend also staying away from citrus juices. Orange juice does not ferment well. Well, it does ferment well, but a lot of the taste of the orange juice comes from its sugars, so it kind of comes out tasting like rubbing alcohol when you ferment it. So, not recommended. It's good as an adjunct, which is secondary flavor. As long as it's not the majority of your brew, it should come out just fine. So if you want to get something that's a little more efficient, that's a little more quote-unquote professional, there's a couple things you can get into. You can get distilled water, or spring water, or filtered water is what I recommend. You can use distilled water or water that's been reverse osmosis. However, you'll find that the end result is kind of lacking because the minerals in the water were taken out through that process, which actually provides some mouthfeel texture for lack of a better term. Get an actual carboy fermenter instead of a jug with a loose lid. Get an actual fermenter of some sort. They have these glass carboys. They have 5-gallon fermenting buckets. Essentially, they're the same buckets you can get at Home Depot or Lowe's. They just have holes drilled for bungs to put an airlock in, or a bottling spigot screwed on the side. But you can go down to Home Depot, spend $2.50 on a bucket, and that'll work. Brewing yeast, instead of using the actual bread yeast, you get stuff that's meant for the job. They have really good documentation on these that goes into how much alcohol they can produce effectively before the yeast starts to go dormant, and some produce different flavors during the fermentation process, like fruity esters is what they call them, or kind of a baked flavor. It all kind of depends per strain, so do your research, see what you go. But like I said, D47 is my go-to. An actual airlock, some people do use balloons. They work. They're one-time use, really. And if the fermentation does going pretty crazy, it can pop that balloon off, and then you don't have an airlock on there. So I recommend getting an actual airlock. This is called an S-type or a double bubbler, some people call them. You can see there's two little lines here. So you would fill this with sanitizer or vodka, something neutral in taste, but has a little bit of alcohol content or something to prevent mold from growing. And what that does is it lets air come up through this tube, or CO2 actually will come up through this tube, cause it to bubble, release it, but it keeps a seal so no bad stuff, bugs or bacteria or anything can get in there. And hydrometer, that would be this thing here. What this does is it allows you to measure the specific gravity or the density of your brew. So you can see these have little lines with numbers next to them. So right here is 1.00. That's the density of water. If you drop that into distilled water, it just shows nothing, essentially. The higher that the scale goes, the more sugar that's dissolved in solution, which therefore the more fermentables that are dissolved in the solution. You can also get a thermometer, which I got right here. This is more useful for beer than it is for wines, but it is semi-useful for wines because you don't want to put your yeast in, which is called pitching the yeast. If it's above 120, that'll kill it. Typically, room temperature to 90 degrees, anywhere in that range is just fine. You can also get some yeast nutrients, which I have a few varieties of here. There it is. This is called Go Firm. This goes in with the yeast when you're hydrating it before you brew. This provides nutrients that the must, which is the mixture of juices, sugars, whatever that you're making, has. The yeast needs these nutrients in order to reproduce effectively, especially when it comes to meads. Wines, the grapes and whatever other fruits you put in there tend to have a lot of these nutrients already available to the yeast. However, honey is very lacking in it. So meads especially, you do want to use this. Now, so this is called Yeast Energizer. I bought this one accidentally. I don't use it. The majority of this is diammonium phosphate, which again provides some nutrients for the yeast that they can't get from the honey. But it's not organic, and I like to use as organic or at least all natural products in my brews. So this actually I'm just using for fertilizer. And then there is this. There's Fermaid O. There's also Fermaid K, which is the same, essentially the same thing, except that has a tiny bit of diammonium phosphate, the DAP, in there. But the Fermaid O is fully organic. This goes into the brew through the fermentation process. There's some really good guides online depending on what your sugar content is, how much to add, and at what time intervals. And very important would be some kind of sanitizer. I use Star San. It's probably the most popular. It's very readily available at any brew shop. You can get it on Amazon. This was about 14 bucks on Amazon. Doesn't look like a whole lot, but it only takes, what was it, 1 ounce of this for 5 gallons of water. So what I usually do is I put a little bit in a jug. This is just water, but an example. Put a little bit in a jug, fill it up with a little under 1/4 of an ounce of the Star San, mix it up, and then I put it in a spray bottle, and then you can really easily just sanitize. So that covers the basics of what you need to do, or what you need to get into brewing. Alright, so yeah, let's go into the definitions a little bit. So there's what's called the must, or the mash, or the wash, or whatever, depending on what you're brewing. It has various names. Essentially what it is the water that you're starting with the sugars from whatever source is dissolved into it. If you're doing a wine, it's called a must. If you're doing a beer, it's called a mash, and then a wort. And then if you're doing it for distilling purposes, it'll be a wash. Then there's the lees, which I will show you one of my mistakes. Well, mistake isn't the correct word. I got a little greedy. If you look in the bottom of this bottle here, you can see all this sediment. That's what's called the lees. It's various particulates that are dissolved or suspended, at least, in the brew, and the dead yeast, any solids from fruits or whatever. That one I was scraping basically the bottom of the barrel because I wanted to get as many bottles as possible out of that one because I was bringing it for a party. And when it comes to beer brewing, correspondence to the lees is going to be called the trub. Basically, it's the same thing, except also it can have hop pieces that have fallen out of solution. There's a lot of ways you can clean that up. The most effective is just time. If you see that it looks really cloudy, let it sit for a couple of weeks and it'll be clear like this. Yeah, you can see how clear that is. Nutrients, I kind of went into that a little bit. The majority of the nutrients that are in these, the Fermento and the Go Firm, especially because these ones are the organic, is actually what they call ghost cells or yeast hulls or ghost hulls. It's essentially just dead yeast. You can actually make that yourself pretty easily. You can get some bread yeast, throw it into a pot of boiling water for about 10 minutes, let it cool, and strain out the liquid, just keeping the solids, which is just going to be your yeast hulls. So that provides a lot of nitrogen and some phosphorus, magnesium, amino acids, proteins, which just helps the yeast colony start growing so they can start producing alcohol quicker and cleaner. You'll get less off flavors if you use that. Then, yeah, gravity. I went over gravity a little bit. Fermentation, there's a couple of different nomenclatures people will use. They'll use primary fermentation, which is really the only actual fermentation. That's when your yeast is working to convert the sugars into alcohol and ethanol alcohol and CO2. Then there's what they call secondary fermentation, which actually is clarification and clearing. What that is after you finish the fermentation, you check with your hydrometer to make sure it's stopped. Then you remove it from one container to another container to let it sit, kind of age, but more you're just letting everything fall out before you bottle it or rack it to another container. Degassing, one of the byproducts of fermentation is CO2, which a lot of that will stay suspended and dissolved into the brew. So you go ahead and stir that up. You can buy equipment that hooks to a drill and do it, or do what I do. Have a nice spoon with some holes in it so you get a lot of exposed surface area, and you can go through and mix it up without adding too much oxygen. And you'll often hear it bubble. You'll hear that fizz like you just cracked open a Sprite. That's the CO2 leaving solution. Racking, that's when just moving it from one container to another. Bottle conditioning and natural carbonation, they're the same thing. Some people just refer to them differently. That's essentially when you're letting the yeast that's still in solution in the beer or the wine or whatever you're making, adding a tiny bit of sugar and then bottling it up And what that allows is the yeast will produce a tiny bit more alcohol, but then it'll kind of cut off because you're not adding very much. But the CO2 will remain in there and pressurized, so then when you pop it open, you get the carbonation. Then there's forced carbonation, which is essentially kegging. You put in a keg, hook a CO2 tube to one side, and pressurize it with CO2. Stabilizing. So, what stabilizing is, after your fermentation is either done or at the level you want to have it at, you would add something, or actually a couple of things. There's potassium metabisulfite. I don't use that. And potassium sorbate. I don't use that either. And what that does is it causes the yeast to go dormant, and so you can back sweeten. You can add more sugar if it's a little drier than you like. I don't use it because it's not 100%. If you don't do it just right, then the yeast won't all go dormant. You can have a bottle bomb on your hands, or after a period of time, it wears off, the yeast become active again. So if you're letting it age for a while, that can be an issue. The surest way, the two sure ways to prevent re-fermentation is you either overload it with sugar. So let's say your yeast can handle up to 14% alcohol, but you still want it to be a little bit sweeter, which that's what I'm going to be doing today. You put in a little bit more sugar, so it reached that 14%. The yeast reaches the alcohol tolerance, goes dormant, and there's still some sweetness that remains. Or you can throw it in a like Instant Pot. Just put the bottle in Instant Pot with the cap on very loosely, and you heat it up at about 140 degrees for about 15 minutes. That's internal temperature, so what's inside the bottle, about 140 degrees for about 15 minutes. And that'll pasteurize. That'll actually kill the yeast, so there's no chance of it coming back. So those are the two ways that are 100% effective. And then back sweetening again, that's just adding more sugar, so it comes to that sweeter point after the fact.